Hello, 8th graders. This is an optional read aloud of the passage that you're being assigned for class today. In Lesson 111, you're being asked to read chapters 1 and 2 of Frederick Douglass's memoir, Narrative of the Life of an American Slave. This text is pretty challenging, so I'm offering this read aloud to you. You can read it with me as I read it aloud, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening while we read, but mostly it's just a read aloud. You can listen to this recording while you read, or you can skip past this section and you can read the text on your own independently. That is a choice that you can make, okay? If you're staying with me, we will get started on the video. Chapter 1. Before I start actually reading Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, I do want to warn you that there is some really difficult content here. The text is a little bit difficult to read, but it's also true that what he writes about is very difficult. It's violent and it's brutal and it's hard to read and hear. And so I can promise you that we can talk about some of these things, especially if you're having a hard time with it. But I also should warn you that I do have a hard time reading it without crying, but I will do my best, I promise. Okay, now we can start. Chapter 1. I was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsboro and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs. And it is the wish of most masters, within my knowledge, to keep their slaves thus ignorant. This just means, like a horse doesn't know how old he is, neither did the slaves. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom came nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. He was unhappy that he didn't know. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. And a restless spirit in slave days might mean they try to run away. Back to the text. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say sometime during 1835 I was about 17 years old. So think about the time period that this is being written in, right? Sorry. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. So he's talking about their skin color. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my patronage. So everybody said that he was a white man. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me, means he couldn't know. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It was a common custom, in the part of Maryland from which I ran away, to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of a mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. So he mentions here that children were taken from their mothers and not allowed to see one another. I never saw my mother. to know her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration and at night. She was hired by Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot, after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise unless the slave... Okay, I apologize for that. I'm going to return back to this part of the text. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her hard day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty for not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives to him that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. So a kind master might allow them not to be in a field at the same time, but that was rare, is basically what he's saying. I do not recollect ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper that my master was my father may or may not be true, and, true or false, it is of but little consequence to my purpose whilst the fact remains, in all its glaring odiousness, that slaveholders have ordained, and by law established, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers, and this is done too obviously to administer to their own lusts, and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement, the slaveholder, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. Okay, what was just said? Basically, the white male slave owner could take advantage of an African American slave woman, and they may have a child together. But that child is still very much a slave. He does not have any privileges of the white man during slave times. Okay, that's what this means. I know of such cases, and it is worthy of remark that such slaves invariably suffer greater hardships and have more to contend with than others, so those that have a white father that is also their master have a more difficult time, is what he's saying. They are, in the first place, a constant offense to their mistress, so to the woman, the man's wife. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing to his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. The master is frequently compelled to sell this class of his slaves, sell his children, out of deference to the feelings of his white wife, and, cruel as the deed may strike any one to be, for a man to sell his own children to human flesh-mongers, it is often the dictate of humanity for him to do so, for, unless he does this, he must not only whip them himself, but must stand by and see one white son tie up his brother of but a few shades darker complexion than himself, and ply the gory lash to his naked back. And if he lisps one word of disapproval, it is set down to his parental partiality and only makes a bad matter worse for both himself and the slave whom he would protect and defend. So he's basically saying if he doesn't sell his son off to someone else as the slave owner, he then has to be cruel to him instead. Wow. Every year brings with it multitudes of this class of slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of a knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that a very different-looking class of people are springing up in the South, and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase do no other good, it will do away the force of the argument that God cursed Ham, and therefore American slavery is right. So this is a biblical allusion, and it's talking about a place in the Bible that often people in this time, when they had slaves, they would justify their actions based on one section of the Bible that they misinterpreted, okay, or that they had read. And so what he's saying to this is, if these people are no longer truly Africans of dark descent, and now they're a mix of white and black, we can't have that argument anymore. That's what he's trying to say here. If the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be scripturally enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unscriptural, or unright, according to the Bible. For thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers, and those fathers most frequently their own masters. I have two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. Sorry, I'm going to turn off that sound. I do not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which, I presume, he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. His farms and slaves were under the care of an overseer. The overseer's name was Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, who drank a lot, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with cowskin and heavy cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly that even master would be enraged at his cruelty, and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. That means that the master was so surprised that the overseer was that cruel. That's how cruel he was being. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered in blood. It's going to get a little tough here, okay? No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim could seem to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swinging the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master, and under the following circumstances. So he is about to tell the story about his aunt, and this is arguably one of the toughest sections of the text. It's going to get a little bit brutal. If you feel like you can't listen anymore, please feel free to stop listening, and we can talk, okay? And you can email me. Aunt Hester. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings, and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company with a young man, who was paying attention to her, belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned, because Lloyd owned Ned. He was a slave. Why master was so careful of her, may it safely left to conjecture, which is a wonder. She was a woman of noble form, and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. This just means she was really beautiful. Aunt Hester not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstances I found from what he said while whipping her was the chief offense. Had he been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt, but those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen, and he stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. And then he told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time 2 swear words. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now you," swear words, "I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay the heavy cowskin, and soon the warm red blood, amidst heart-rending shrieks from her, and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight, that I hid myself in a closet and dared not to venture out till long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she was put to raise the children of younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation. Chapter 2. That's probably the most difficult part of the text, okay? Thanks for sticking with me. Chapter 2. My mother's family consisted of 2 sons. Sorry, my master's family. Good readers, go back and check, right? My master's family consisted of 2 sons, Andrew and Richard, 1 daughter, Lucretta, and her husband, Captain Thomas Auld. They lived in one house upon the home plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd. My master was Colonel Lloyd's clerk and superintendent. He was what might be called the overseer of the overseers. I spent 2 years of childhood on this plantation with my old master's family. It was here that I witnessed the bloody transaction recorded in the first chapter, and as I received my first impressions of slavery on this plantation, I will give some description of it, and of slavery as it there existed. The plantation is about 12 miles north of Easton in Talbot County, and is situated on the border of Miles River. The principal products raised upon it were tobacco, corn, and wheat. These were raised in great abundance, so a lot, so that with the products of this and other farms belonging to him, he was able to keep in almost constant employment a large sloop in carrying them to market at Baltimore. This sloop was named Sally Lloyd's, in honor of one of the colonel's daughters. My master's son-in-law, Captain Auld, was master of the vessel, a ship. She was otherwise manned by Colonel's own slaves. Their names were Peter, Isaac, Rich, and Jake. These were esteemed very highly by the other slaves, and looked upon as the privileged ones on the plantation, for it was no small affair in the eyes of a slave to be allowed to see Baltimore. Baltimore is just a city. So these four African-American slaves were kind of treated with more respect by the other African-American slaves, not necessarily by the slave owners. Colonel Lloyd kept from 300 to 400 slaves on his home plantation, and owned a large number more on the neighboring farms belonging to him. The names of the farms nearest to the home plantation were Weetown and New Design. Weetown was under the overseership of a man named Noah Willis. New Design was under the overseership of Mr. Townsend. The overseers of these and all the rest of those farms, numbering over 20, received advice and direction from the managers of the home plantation. This was a great business. It was a seat of government for the whole 20 farms. All disputes among the overseers were settled there, and if a slave was convicted of any high misdemeanor, became unmanageable, or evinced a determination to run away, he was brought immediately here, severely whipped, put on board the sloop or ship, carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to the slaves remaining. So basically the overseer is kind of like a manager, like the farm manager, but he managed the slaves. And then all the managers were under direction of Colonel Lloyd at the home plantation. Here, too, the slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. The men and women slaves received, as their monthly allowance of food, 8 pounds of pork, or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter, made of coarse negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children was given to their mothers, or to the old women having care of them. The children unable to work in the field had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these failed them, they went naked until the next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old, of both sexes, almost naked, might be seen at all seasons of the year, and this is a place where snow happens and it's cold, like here. There were no beds given to slaves unless 1 coarse blanket be considered such, and none but the men and women had these, meaning no children had even a blanket. This, however, is not considered a very great privation. They found less difficulty from the want of beds than from the want of time to sleep, for when their day's work in the field is done, the most of them having their washing, mending, and cooking to do, having few or none of the ordinary facilities for doing either of these, very many of their sleeping hours are consumed in preparing for the field the coming day, and when this is done, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on one common bed, the cold, damp floor, each covering himself or herself with their miserable blankets, and here they sleep till they are summoned to the field by the driver's horn. He's basically saying they weren't as concerned with having a bed because by the time they finally got to lay down and go to sleep, they didn't care what they laid on. Okay, down here. At the sound of this, all must rise and be off to the field. There must be no halting. Everyone must be at his or her post, and woe betides them who hear not this morning summons to the field. For if they are not awakened by the sense of hearing, they are by the sense of feeling. No age nor sex finds any favor. Mr. Sevier, the overseer, used to stand by the door of the quarter armed with a large heavy stick and heavy cowskin, ready to whip anyone who was so unfortunate as not to hear, or, from any other cause, was prevented from being ready to start for the field at the sound of the horn. So if they were not there in the morning, they would be whipped. Mr. Severe was rightly named. He was a cruel man. I have seen him whip a woman, causing the blood to run half an hour at the time, and this, too, in the midst of her crying children pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity, so he whipped her for half an hour. Added to his cruelty, he was a profane swearer. It was enough to chill the blood and stiffen the hair of an ordinary man to hear him talk. Scarce a sentence escaped him, but that was commenced or concluded by some horrid oath, like some horrid promise, basically. The field was the place to witness his cruelty and profanity. His presence made it both the field of blood and of blasphemy. From the rising till the going down of the sun, he was cursing, raving, cutting, and slashing among the slaves of the field in the most frightful manner. His career was short. He died very soon after I went to Colonel Lloyd's, and he died as he lived, uttering with his dying groans bitter curses and horrid oaths. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of merciful providence. That just means that they felt like that their God had helped make sure that he could no longer oversee them. Mr. Severe's place was filled by Mr. Hopkins. He was a very different man. He was less cruel, less profane, and made less noise than Mr. Severe. His course was characterized by no extraordinary demonstrations of cruelty. He whipped, but seemed to take no pleasure in it. He was called by the slaves a good overseer. The home plantation of Colonel Lloyd wore the appearance of a country village. All the mechanical operations for all the farms were performed here. The shoemaking and mending, the blacksmithing, cartwrighting, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding were all performed by the slaves on the home plantation. The whole place wore a business-like aspect, very unlike the neighboring farms. The number of houses, too, conspired to give it advantage over the neighboring farms. It was called by the slaves the Great House Farm. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves of the out farms than that of being selected to do errands at the Great House Farm. It was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to have a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the out farms would be to his election to do errands at the Great House Farm. So this means that the slaves felt like their ability to work at the Great House Farm was as amazing as somebody would feel if they were elected to American Congress. So they were very proud of it, is what he's trying to say. They regarded it as evidence of great confidence reposed in them by their overseers, and it was on this account, as well as a constant desire to be out of the field from under the driver's lash, that they esteemed it a high privilege, one worth careful living for. He was called the smartest and most trusty fellow, one who had this honor conferred upon him the most frequently. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers as the office-seekers in the political parties seek to please and deceive the people. The same traits of character might be seen in Colonel Lloyd's slaves as are seen in the slaves of the political parties. So he's making a connection here to the American government at this time. So he's saying the slaves fought each other just as hard as our people trying to get into office fight each other. So think about all the advertisements on TV where they put each other down, right? And they try to win your vote. Same thing is happening when the black people are trying to please the overseers. They're trying to get this honor bestowed upon them to have this job. The slaves selected to go to the Great House Farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves were peculiarly enthusiastic. While on their way, they would make the dense old woods for miles around reverberate reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy and the deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. They thought that the thought that came out, if not in the word, in the sound, and as frequently in one as in the other. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiments in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. Into all of their songs they would manage to weave something of the Great House Farm. Especially would they do this when leaving home. They would sing most exultingly to the following words: "I am going away to the Great House Farm. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh." This they would sing as a chorus to words which many would seem unmeaning jargon, but which nevertheless were full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. So I don't know if you can think back, maybe music class in elementary school, you may have sang some songs that African Americans would sing during times of slavery, like "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." What he's referencing here is that might sound upbeat, and if you weren't careful to listen to the words or know what they mean, you might think that they're happy. But in fact, those words have deep meaning, and they show they're not happy. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meanings of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard as those without might see or hear. I told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension, and they were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaints of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery, and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. Okay, so those songs that some might construe as happy, he knows their meaning is actually very, very sad, that they're prayers and cries for help. I have frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to these songs even now afflicts me, and while I am writing these lines, an expression of feeling has already found its way down my cheek. So as he's writing, he's crying. To those songs I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. I can never get rid of that conception. Those songs still follow me to deepen my hatred of slavery and quicken my sympathies for my brethren in bonds. If anyone wishes to be impressed with the soul-killing effects of slavery, let them go to Colonel Lloyd's plantation and, on allowance day, place himself in the deep pine woods, and there let him, in silence, analyze the sounds that shall pass through the chambers of his soul. And if he not thus impressed, it will only be because there is no flesh in his obdurate heart. He means to say, if anyone is not sure about whether or not slavery is good or bad, let them go to these woods and listen to these songs. And if they don't get inspired that slavery is terrible, it's only because they don't have a heart, is what he's saying. I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment or happiness. It is impossible to conceive a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The song of the slave represents the sorrow of his heart, and he is relieved by them, only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least, such in my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon to me whilst in the jaws of slavery. The singing of a man cast away upon a desolate island might be appropriately considered as evidence of contentment and happiness, as the singing of a slave, the songs of one and of the other are prompted by the same emotion. So he's saying if you can imagine someone who's stranded for life on a desert island, maybe they sing, but it's not of happiness, and that same comparison can be made of a slave. We're going to stop here at chapter 3. Tomorrow, for lesson 112, you will read chapters 3 through 5, and you will have another video that you can choose to watch and listen to while I read aloud. But again, that's just a choice. If you have any questions about what was read here today, if you don't understand, or if you just want to try to process some of the cruelty that you heard, please know that you can email me or connect with me on Skype. Have a great day, everyone.